Dragonflight Season 4 is about to start, and I thought we should talk a bit about tanks. Hi, it's Llarold, and I'm going to talk about my Season 4 tank recap / tier list, but first, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, so let's just start by talking about tank changes. You might notice this video is coming out a little later than usual for us, and that's because I kept holding off expecting some last-minute class changes to tanks, and they never came. There are no changes at all. Apparently tank balance is perfect already, has been for the last 5 months. Maybe there will be some changes to tanks mid-season, but I don't know, I'm not really holding my breath. Now to quickly cover all the tank tier sets, Vengeance, Demon Hunter, Monk, and Warrior are all sticking with their Season 3 tier sets. This is great for Vengeance. They've been the best tank maybe ever, and that's in part due to the tier set. And honestly, it's pretty good for Warrior. The underlying Warrior class is weak, but the tier set is good, and it's pretty fun. As for Monks, this is kind of bad news for rating. It's good news for Mythic Plus, though, and that's really what Season 4 is going to be all about, so I guess it's good news for them, too. I have wanted to enjoy Monk in Raid in Season 4, just like I wanted to in Season 3, but it looks like that's not going to happen either time. Blood DK and Bear Druid are going back to their Season 2 tier set bonuses, which is a huge upgrade for Bears. For DK, I think it's clearly a lot weaker for Raid, but it's stronger for Mythic Plus, so again, probably better overall for the scope of Season 4. And finally, Paladin is getting their Season 1 tier set bonus back, which has actually been buffed to grant an extra 2% versatility and 2% parry chance all the time, so, you know, it's still boring, but it's actually very good for Mythic Plus and a lot less annoying to use than the Season 3 tier set bonuses were, so I think this is an upgrade for Paladin as well. So with all that being said, let's get into the tier list proper. Because this is primarily a Mythic Plus focused season, this is going to be a Mythic Plus focused tier list. Let's say 95% Mythic Plus and 5% Raid. Basically, in case of any ties, the Raid will become the tiebreaker, I guess, but otherwise it's a Mythic Plus tier list. And as always, the same disclaimer always applies to any sort of tier list. This is my opinion, it's for fun. It's mainly just to have a chance to talk about the tanks, really, and to kind of give recommendations on what I think will be strong and what you should play, and like if you want to have fun and be good and you're feeling indecisive, you want some advice, okay? Okay. All right, let's get right into it. We'll just start with Blood DK. I think Blood is definitely getting a bit of an upgrade in the coming tier. Or season, I should say. I think they were one of the weakest tanks. They were certainly one of the most popular tanks throughout all of Season 3, but that popularity doesn't necessarily translate into goodness at the highest end. That's also one of the difficulties that it comes with any sort of talking about tier list. Are you trying to talk about the people who are playing MDI? Are you trying to talk about people who are trying to push 30 plus? Are you trying to talk about the common man, the person pushing just, you know, they're doing their weekly 20s? And I think the thing of ranking all the tanks for people who are just doing their weekly 20s, you know, all the tanks are, I mean, they all could, like, this is can you do your plus 20? This is the 20 tier list. All of them can do it. It's fine. So, you know, you kind of do want to think about things in a bit more of a competitive state. And so I think for competitive play, the problem with Blood DK is the same problem it's basically always had, which is that it really struggles to stay alive while picking up groups of mobs. It has this sort of friction between using Blood Boil to pick stuff up, using Blood Boil and Death and Decay to pick stuff up, I suppose, to generate AoE threat, using Marrow Rend to get your Bone Shield charges active so that you don't get murdered by the first time something auto-attacks you, using Heart Strike to generate runic power, and using Death Strike to stay alive. And so you have to do all of these things in conjunction with each other, and on some level that's just like gameplay. But on another level, it makes it hard to get your active mitigation going, get your self-healing going, and have AoE threat at the start of pulls. This is pretty easy to do when you have your cooldowns available, and nightmarishly difficult when you don't. And so for that reason, I think they're pretty middle of the road. I do think that their tier set bonus going back to the Season 2 tier set that is focused all around Vampiric Blood, free Vampiric Blood procs, increased strength bonuses while you have Vampiric Blood active, I think that helps them. But frankly, I think that pulls them out of being kind of a low tier tank that was really only super duper popular in Mythic Plus because it was so incredibly strong in Raid, and people who play it in Raid will then also go do Mythic Plus with it. I don't think it was good or popular in Mythic Plus because it was good in Mythic Plus. I think it was popular in Mythic Plus because it is good in Raid. And so I think it's going to stay right around that middle of the pack range. Not particularly great, not bad, but just so. Definitely a bit of a difficult tank to actually play well in Mythic Plus, and the end result is that it's pretty good, which is, you know, if you're working really hard to get something that's pretty good, that doesn't feel great. It really should be like incredibly good if you're having to work super hard. All right, so I've sort of organized these in such a way that Warrior would be next, and I think Warrior is definitely a step down from DK. Now, maybe I should make like a B-, an A-, an A+, and whatever, but I think Warrior clearly is a step down from DK. It deals less damage. It has problems with damage. It doesn't have problems with threat, and it doesn't have any of the real problems that Blood DK has with picking stuff up at the start of pulls and getting your active mitigation going. It's basically the exact opposite. You charge in, press Avatar, shield block is easy to get going, and then you demoralizing shout, shield charge, start hitting ignore pain, thunderclap. You know, it's very easy to pick up threat, very easy to establish threat and active mitigation and get your defenses rolling. Very easy class to play, very fun to play. I think generally speaking, if we're doing fun lists, we're making a new tier above S for Warrior as the most fun tank. And I think I tweeted something along these lines earlier today. When Warrior is the meta tank, that is when the game is at its most fun for tanks. But unfortunately, it's not, and there's no changes coming, and there's no changes to their tier set. So I think they're definitely, you know, if middle of the pack is B, and I think that's fair, then Warrior is definitely at one step down from middle of the pack. It's definitely a step back. Paladin is kind of technically getting a tier set bonus that I think on paper on a training dummy is weaker than their season 3 tier set bonus, but in practical reality, you know, in playing the game, you go from having this ramping damage reduction buff that goes anywhere on average from like 6 to 10%, and then this empowered consecration damage thing. Instead, you basically just have a permanent 7% versatility, or 8% versatility and 7% parry chance, and then you also are able to share that with somebody else. And I think that puts Paladin somewhere in the very top tier of tanks, because you go from having this sort of inconsistent and annoying bonus that like constrains your movement to having just like complete freedom, permanent uptime at maximum effect on a pretty large versatility and parry buff. And like mechanically, that's very boring. You know, it might as well just be like, what if a tier set bonus was like, here's 15 gem sockets? That's basically what the Paladin tier set bonus is, but that doesn't mean it's bad. And the underlying class is insanely strong, insanely strong. It doesn't do great damage, but like Warrior, it has a really easy time establishing initial threat and getting their active mitigation going. They're not in the case of Blood DK where they're like struggling to kind of have this interplay between you have to do one thing to establish threat and a different thing to defend yourself and a different third thing to heal yourself. Like Paladin has a very easy time getting threat and also getting their active mitigation rolling, and so I think they're in really good shape there. They do have the very wonky, or I shouldn't say wonky, but really just like annoying healing that is on the global cooldown, but then they're able to use that to heal their group. So I think that puts them in the absolute upper echelon of tanks. Normally, of course, there is Demon Hunter here, which is still capable of doing substantially more damage and being more tanky, and it has more CC than Paladin somehow, so I think that is kind of the one thing that would push Paladin down at all. Bear Druid is going back to their Season 2 tier set bonus, which gives them increased rage. It gives them healing based on their damage taken, like they heal for 6 or 8% of all the damage they take. I think it's 8% over 6 seconds. Doesn't matter. The point is it's a lot of healing based on damage taken. There's also just increased health, increased damage on Mangle and Maul, and it's an incredibly strong tier set bonus. Also more rage, so more rage to spend on Raze. You know, season 2, late through season 2, when they got their rework, Bear Druid was the strongest tank in the game by a mile. Then they got nerfed going into season 3 and Demon Hunter got buffed, and Druid also got a very lousy tier set that really caused them to slide way back. The nerfs aren't being reverted, but the tier set is being swapped back to the season 2 tier set. So I think the Bear Druids are going to be mixing it up as another top tier tank. I think they're going to be competitive with Paladin. I think the real difference here is that Bear Druid is like kind of more of a selfish tank. They still frankly have a lot of group healing, but a lot of it is simpler. You know, it's passive group healing. You're not having to like look at the frame and mouse over somebody's name and tap your keybind in order to actually cast a heal on them. Although you can spec into that with Dream of Cenarius, you can just passively heal your group a lot with After the Wildfire. So I think that Bear Druid's in really good shape. I could go either way with them. With Paladin, the fact that Bear Druid is able to do a lot more burst damage than Paladin kind of maybe puts them ahead of Paladin for me even. They're both pretty competitive in terms of group utility. Bear Druid is really good at dealing with a lot of Mythic Plus affixes, so is Paladin. You know, think about things like Entangling. Paladin can freedom themselves and the healer out of every single one. Technically, Paladin and Druid can both deal with incorporeal adds, but Druid's a little better. They can both deal with afflicted adds, but Druid is arguably a little better because you can deal with afflicted adds both by dispelling them and by just passively radiating After the Wildfire heals into them. There's a lot of value in both of these two tanks, so they're both really, really, really strong. And for my money, I think that Druid might actually be more fun. I think certainly in an organized group where you're more confident with the people that you're playing with, Druid is more fun. In disorganized groups where maybe you're just not going to get one of the people in the group just isn't going to interrupt no matter how many times you tell them to, then Paladin can really carry that. Like, I've been in plenty of groups that went totally fine where everybody in the group was doing an absolutely terrible job of interrupting, and it didn't matter because I was on a Paladin. I was able to just completely carry them on that front and just let them just like watch TV or whatever it was that they were doing instead and just do damage, and it was fine. I was a little annoyed that I was having to do their job, but you know, everything was fine. All right, now unfortunately we have to move on to my once favorite class, and that would be Monk, and I think it's easily the worst one. I think when we talk about working harder and getting less reward from Blood DK, I think Monk is so much more of a shining example of that. It has so many more keybinds than all of the other tanks. It is so much harder work to be competitive, and the end result is that you have very weak group utility. You know, you have Leg Sweep, you have Ring of Peace for dealing with like sanguine mobs. You have the ability to paralyze incorporeal adds and dispel afflicted adds. Like, you have good utility when it comes to affixes. The affix utility is good, but you don't have any sort of spell warding, you don't have any sort of group healing, you don't have any sort of grips or silences, you just have Leg Sweep and Ring of Peace, and those really are not competitive with the state of Bear Druid or Prot Paladin or Blood DK or Demon Hunter. And then on top of all of that, Monk is probably the glass cannoniest of all of the tanks. I think they've been less of a glass cannon throughout Season 3 than they have been in past expansions, barring like Shadowlands Season 3 and 4, but given that that is kind of the metric for comparison, along with just Demon Hunter being a main metric for comparison, I think they've been pretty disappointing. I would say that they compare, they're pretty comparable with Prot Warrior, but if I had to put one ahead of the other, and I do, unfortunately, as much as I like Monk, I think that they're probably weaker than Warrior. They're definitely better for damage. They're better for damage than Warrior. I think they'll probably be better for damage than DK in this coming season as well. Maybe DK's kind of been bolstered by the Legendary as well, and the Legendary is not going away. It's going to get upgraded, so Monk was probably going to be behind because of that as well. They are better than Paladin at dealing damage. They probably won't be better than Druid at dealing damage. So if we're just doing like damage rankings, I think it would probably be this, right? With Demon Hunter, obviously, like off the screen, off the top, but probably would look, I think like this, right? Paladin being low, Warrior being low, Monk being ahead of them, DK probably being pretty competitive due to the Legendary keeping them up. And yeah, that's just kind of disappointing considering that their utility is really just super lackluster, and you know, their class tree is a mess. I think that's getting fixed in the War Within, fortunately, but just as it currently stands, it's a real mess. And it didn't change yet, so that would put Monk at the bottom. And then obviously, Demon Hunter is the best tank in the game right now for Mythic Plus. It does insane amounts of damage. It has insane amounts of crowd control. It has 2 Sigil of Silences on relatively short cooldowns. You have cooldown reduction on your sigils. You have cooldown reduction on your main Sigil of Flame, you have Sigil of Chains to CC enemies, you have Sigil of Misery to CC enemies, you have Chaos Nova to CC enemies. You have so much crowd control on this one class. I mean, you have Imprison to CC enemies or to deal with incorporeal ads. You just have so much crowd control on this one class. And that maybe would be acceptable if it wasn't also like impossibly tanky. It's almost impossible to die on a Demon Hunter. And also it does an ungodly amount of damage. So it's just like three different things that if they had two of the three, they would still be very strong. Probably overpowered, but maybe not just like a runaway favorite compared to the other 5 tanks, but they have just an unprecedented amount of control over enemies, an incredible amount of damage, and an incredible amount of tankiness. I think the biggest downside to Demon Hunter is that the playstyle is really not that fun in the current configuration. I really liked it initially. I thought, oh, you know, this is pretty cool playing around with it in the Season 3 PTR, you know, this is a big switch on things, the Sigil playstyle, it's going to be something new and different, and it has been something new and different and overpowered. But I gotta say, it's kind of gotten stale pretty quickly. I really don't love Sigils as a main mechanic. Ground targeting them, either like actually doing it by hand or using macros and just having to point your cursor at things, like, you know what? This is something that none of the other tanks really have as like a core gameplay loop, targeting stuff on the ground over and over and over and over again. And there's a reason for that. It really is a lot better in terms of the way that WoW is made, the flow of combat, to target enemies and hit them with your skills. And that is kind of the way that the vast majority of skills and classes in this game function, and it's been like that for close to 20 years, and it turns out there's a reason for that, because when you break away from that and you are mainly throwing most of your skills on the ground, it feels really weird and not that great. You know, this isn't an RTS game, this isn't a MOBA. It's very weird to like constantly be focusing in on exactly where my mouse is and making sure that I'm dropping stuff in the right spot all the time. I've kind of gotten tired, clearly, of the Sigil playstyle. There's also some of the issues of initial threat, where if you hit enemies with a Sigil that you're not in combat with, there's some issues with threat where it just like won't generate threat on them. So a lot of stuff that really makes picking up initial threat on a Demon Hunter pretty frustrating. It's not really an issue like Blood DK has to deal with, where you're spending these skills to generate this resource and doing this to generate that. It's really just bugs on Blizzard's end, where you're just not generating initial threat if you're not already in combat with enemies when you hit them with that opening Sigil. Just very, very bad design. I mean, just frankly a bug that causes a lot of the problem for Demon Hunter. Ultimately, it still doesn't feel good to play, regardless of whether it's an intended design or a bug. Like, just, you know, knowing why this thing stinks doesn't make it stink less, right? So that is basically how I feel. I think Demon Hunter is going to be the top dog still going forward, barring any sudden like massive last minute changes. Demon Hunter is still the front runner. I think Bear Druid and Prot Pally are both very clearly in a tier just below that. They're very good tanks. I think they're a lot more fun. I think they're both fun, and both fun in different ways. I would say that Bear Druid is like definitely better if you're in an organized group, and honestly, it's kind of more fun to actually play from like a selfish perspective, but Paladin just offers so much value to the group. Spell wording, Blessing of Protection, Sacrifice, Healing, Silences. It's just really, really, really strong. Blood DK is definitely a step down from both of those two tanks. It doesn't have the same level of group utility. It is incredibly good at self-sustaining until you get to the absolute highest levels of key pushing, where things will just kill you. It is pretty frustrating to establish initial threat in pulls if you don't have all your cooldowns available, and that's probably, I mean, that is definitely the biggest problem with it as a class. And then finally, Warrior and Monk, they're definitely a cut below. They're a step below the rest of the pack. It's unfortunate. I think they're probably two of the most fun tanks. Certainly Warrior is. Warrior is the most fun tank. If we were to strip all of this away and put just, you know, is it fun? They're all equal in terms of strength and utility and so on. Just they have some miracle. Warrior would be the front runner, but that just isn't how the game works right now, unfortunately. And so I think Warrior's pretty much at the back of the bus, along with Monk. And I think Monk is probably a step down from Warrior, even though I would like them to be better. I think, you know, they've definitely been less popular during the late stages of Season 3, and the reason for that is really simple. They're a lot more complex than all of the other tanks, and the payoff is nothing. The payoff is that they're also less tanky than a lot of the other tanks, and they do pretty good damage. I mean, they do good damage. It's in the upper third of damage, but that's that, you know, to work way harder than on any other tank to do pretty good damage is not acceptable. It needs to be a lot more damage if you're going to put in a lot more effort, and that's just not where monks are right now. All right, let's wrap up. So as someone who cares more about raids than Mythic Plus most of the time, the decision to provide zero tank tuning with Season 4 and to add no new raid affixes or mechanics is pretty disappointing. I think that Blizzard's decision to rework dungeon difficulty is really interesting, and I think it'll make the game appeal to a broader range of players. I think this is undeniably good. It's a good experiment. I have high hopes that it'll work out well. The reduced difficulty of old Dragonflight Mythic Plus dungeons is also a good idea. Nerfing those will make them a lot more fun to play in. So that is the takeaway here. I'm trying to be positive. I think if you like Mythic Plus, if you focus on Mythic Plus or non-plus, just some sort of dungeon content, then this is another season of content for you, and I think it'll be pretty good. It's more stuff to do and play around with in dungeons, and I think that the Dragonflight dungeons might actually be fun this time since they've all been nerfed. They were my least favorite dungeons to do during the first 2 seasons of Dragonflight, but, you know, I am hopeful that they will actually be pretty good this time. I understand that Blizzard is doing a lot of stuff to engage with players outside of World of Warcraft right now, like outside of the retail Dragonflight experience, so time-running Pandaria looks really cool. The War Within is super exciting and coming down the line, and I think there's a lot of fun stuff coming. It really does look like a hopeful, positive time in the state of WoW right now. And I want there to be some class balance to come in the middle of this season. Hopefully there is some class balance to come. My recommendation, just in case there isn't, is that you try playing something new this season. Focus on something other than what you've been playing, just to shake things up for yourself, since it looks like Blizzard probably isn't going to. Alright, that covers it. Thanks for watching and have fun in Dragonflight Season 4. Bye!